Okay, we've officially hit 3 o'clock, so why don't we get things going? Welcome, thank you for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Marsh, and I'm the Director of Membership, Marketing, and Communications with the Organization of American Historians. Our event today is part of a new series of online learning events that we are doing that have been funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are joined today by 3 leaders from the National Archives: Meg Phillips, who is the External Affairs Liaison, Laurence Brewer, Chief Records Officer, and Gary Stern, General Counsel. If you have any questions for our panelists during the course of this event, please use the Q&A feature, as they will not be checking the chat log for questions. Should you have any problems during the course of this event, please feel free to chat me, and I can assist you to the best of my abilities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Meg. She will introduce Laurence and Gary, and we will get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. So you've been looking at a slide that showed what we all looked like when we still left the house. So now you're going to see what we look like now. So let's see. So let me do a quick check. What are people seeing on the screen right now? Are you seeing the speakers? Okay, excellent, awesome, perfect. Okay, thank you, everybody. So welcome, and thank you for your interest in learning more about records in the federal government, both in federal agencies and presidential records in the White House, particularly what happens to these records during the transition between the presidential administrations. So the first thing we want to do is introduce our featured speakers. Laurence Brewer is the Chief Records Officer, and in that role, he leads records management throughout the federal government with an emphasis on electronic records. He provides overall direction and guidance for federal agencies on all aspects of records and information management, including overseeing the scheduling and appraisal of federal records. And that's the process that helps the National Archives determine which records need to actually come into the archives and which can be destroyed after a certain period of time, and how long they need to be retained. So that's a super important function for Laurence to oversee. He also oversees the development of records management regulations and guidance, and evaluating the effectiveness of records management programs in federal agencies. Prior to his current appointment, Laurence held a number of positions in NARA's records management program, including management positions working directly with federal agencies to improve records management government-wide. Prior to joining NARA, so I'm not sure all of you will know our jargon, so I'm going to try to keep my ears open for acronyms and jargon that you might not all understand. We are the National Archives and Records Administration, and we almost always call ourselves NARA, and I can't stop myself from saying it. So from now on, NARA is the National Archives. Prior to joining NARA in 1999, Laurence was a records management consultant working for the EPA and the Virginia Department of Transportation. Laurence is also a senior fellow of the Partnership for Public Services Excellence in Government program, which focuses on developing the leadership skills of senior government employees. He holds an MA in political science from the University of Georgia and a BA in government from the College of William and Mary. So Laurence clearly is our expert in federal records management, working with federal agencies. Our next expert today is Gary M. Stern, and that M is really important because we have 2 Gary Sterns at the National Archives, so we always use the M. So Gary Stern has been the General Counsel of the National Archives and Records Administration since 1998. He provides legal and policy guidance with respect to NARA's implementation of the Federal Records Act, the Presidential Records Act, and all the other statutes, regulations, orders, and directives that govern NARA's multiple archival and records-related responsibilities. Before coming to NARA, Gary worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, and the Washington office of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, where he specialized in national security, classification, and information law issues. While at the ACLU, and this is the thing that's particularly interesting to me, while at the ACLU, Gary participated as a plaintiff in Armstrong versus the Executive Office of the President, which was the first major case involving government email record keeping and whether those email records were fully records governed by our record-keeping laws. Gary's also served as legal consultant to the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Declassification of Information for the Environmental Remediation and Related Programs of the Department of Energy. Gary earned his law degree from Yale Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Journal of International Law. His undergraduate degree is from Vassar College, where he majored in ancient Greek. And finally, I'm Meg Phillips. I'm the External Affairs Liaison for the National Archives. And I'm an archivist and records manager by training, but since 2013, I've been in this sort of communications and partnerships role, where I work with organizations like the OAH on issues of common interest. I have a BA and MA in history and a master's in library science. So I'll be moderating our discussion today for kind of the first maybe 2/3 of the time we have available. I'll be trying to tease out of Gary and Laurence their explanation of how federal records and presidential records work, and in particular, what that means for these periods of transition. For the last 20 or 15 minutes, whatever we have left, we're going to open it up to broader questions. So I encourage you to type your questions into that Q&A box whenever you think of them. And we're going to really focus our attention on the Q&A during the last, third or quarter of our webinar today. So with that, let's get started. Our main topic today, Our main topic today is NARA's role in ensuring the peaceful transfer of knowledge during the transition between administrations. We realize that there's been heightened interest in what will happen to the records of the Trump administration since November's election, and the timing of this session was carefully chosen to be right after Inauguration Day. There are actually a few things we can tell you today that we could not have told you 2 days ago. However, in order to do a coherent job of explaining what happens to records during presidential transitions, we actually need to back up a little bit and explain the laws that govern how we work with federal agencies and how we work with a president. Those laws determine NARA's authority, and they also determine what records we get and how we get them from these two major parts of government. And the two laws actually work in a really different way, which is why we've got two different experts here to talk about each one. NARA also brings in records, this is just a side note, NARA also brings in records from Congress and the Supreme Court, but there's no specific law governing which records we get from those branches of government and how we get them, or from the heads of those branches of government. And in fact, NARA does not take legal custody of the records of Congress or the Supreme Court. All right, so that was all just background, getting us set up to get started. So with this, I'm going to start asking our two panelists a few questions to see if we can lay that groundwork of background for how these record-keeping practices work. Laurence, you first. Can you give us a rough outline of how the Federal Records Act works and what it tells the National Archives to do with federal agencies?
So thanks, Meg, for that question. First, I want to ask, do I have an hour, hour and a half to answer that question? Because
no.
there's a lot there that's involved when we talk about the Federal Records Act. So I'll get to that in a second, but first I want to thank OAH for hosting this, and for you, Meg, for agreeing to facilitate. I really like this format where there's no PowerPoint and we can just have a discussion. So I'm looking forward to the questions and see where we go with the discussion. But I agree, it's a good idea. Let's start with some context and some foundation. And it's hard for me to sort of, wrap my head around, what is going to be the most important points about the Federal Records Act for this audience. I live and breathe this and work it every single day, and a lot of it just is what we do. So I'll look forward to your questions and your comments, and maybe we can hone in some aspects of the Federal Records Act that are important to all of you. But essentially, in as concise and coherent a way as I can possibly say, when you talk about, what does the FRA tell us that we have to do in working with agencies, is it's really a foundation that is in the law, in the Federal Records Act itself, and in the regulations that NARA issues in 36 CFR subchapter B, records management, which all agencies have to comply with. And really what we when we talk about it right out of the law, the definition is trying to ensure adequate and proper documentation for all agencies in the proper management of their records. So as Meg noted earlier, that includes disposition, and it really gets to the full records management lifecycle. So we talk about creation of records, the active management, use of those records within agencies, and then finally, the disposition of those records, whether they are destroyed in accordance with a NARA approved record schedule, or designated by appraisal staff that work for me as permanent and eventually coming to the National Archives. So, you know, the way the law is written is it's very specific. It says that we are to work with agencies on the judicious preservation of records that focuses on promoting the efficiency and effectiveness of government. So in order to do that, both judicious preservation and efficiency and effectiveness, that last stage, disposition, scheduling, appraisal, is critically important to making sure that works properly. The other thing that's really important about the Federal Records Act is that it is a shared responsibility between the National Archives and all the federal agencies. So within the regulations pursuant to the Federal Records Act, there are a number of requirements where agencies must develop a program. So they need to have certain positions, roles, responsibilities executed. They have to have an agency records officer. They have to have a senior agency official for records management, and they have to have all the elements of a records management program throughout the life cycle, from records creation to records disposition, that is compliant with those regs. And then NARA's role, and what my staff do, is provide the oversight of how well agencies are doing in executing their responsibilities for establishing and maintaining a records management program. And just one last point before I turn it back to you, Meg. The way we do this, and this is really important because it gets to how my office, the Office of the Chief Records Officer, is structured, is we interact with those career professionals, the records officers, the senior agency officials for records management and agencies, really in four very specific areas which align to the four programs within my office. So we have a program that focuses on scheduling and appraisal of records. We have a program that covers records management training, because training is critically important for all federal employees in making sure they understand their responsibilities. We have a program that covers records management policy and standards so that agencies know what they need to do. And then finally, we have an oversight and reporting program that assesses how well agencies are doing in executing their responsibilities and complying with those policies and standards. So we found it's very effective to really focus on those program areas and get agencies sort of aware of what their responsibilities are in each of those areas. And that is how we expect agencies to not only establish a program compliant with the Federal Records Act, but make sure that they are carrying out the responsibilities and doing them effectively.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Laurence. All right, Gary, your turn. So can you tell us more about the Presidential Records Act, the other half of this story for NARA? Where does the Presidential Records Act come from and how does it work?
Happy to do so, and I as well would like to thank the OAH for hosting this event, Meg, for you leading it, and I'm so glad that we have so many participants and attendees listening to this topic, which is a great and very timely topic. And Laurence just described the FRA, the Federal Records Act, and it was passed by Congress in 1950, and it defines what is a federal record, in part by defining what is a federal agency. And it's one of the few statutes that actually applies to all three branches. So any federal agency in the executive, legislative, or judicial branch is covered. If they're covered, any agency in all three branches that are covered by the FRA, their records are federal records subject to the FRA. So the question is, what's not covered by the FRA? Well, the statute specifically excludes 4 entities from its coverage. The Congress itself, the Supreme Court, and Meg already mentioned Congress and Supreme Court records that we hold at the National Archives are not covered by any law and are not sort of official government property. The third category that is excluded is the architect of the Capitol, some weird sort of unusual exclusion, but the Office of the Architect of the Capitol is not a federal agency, not subject to the Federal Records Act. And the fourth is the president. So the FRA does not apply to the president. And for our history from President George Washington through President Carter, with the unique exception of Nixon, no law applied to the presidential records, or by that, back then they were principally papers, the presidential papers of all those presidents, and they could literally do whatever they wanted with them. They could take them home, they could donate them, which many, in fact, most did, originally like to the Library of Congress or to their local state historical society or whatever. They could also throw them away, burn them, sell them, do whatever they want. And there is, you know, there are gaps in the old history of presidential papers with presidents that just did not keep track of their papers. And so that was the norm. Although starting with President Roosevelt, when the National Archives was created, President Roosevelt took it as an opportunity to start something new and different. And he said, what he's going to do is he's going to donate his personal presidential papers to the National Archives, which was just created under his presidency. And not only that, he's going to build a building, call it a library, and give that, not only give the papers, but give the building, the presidential library, to the National Archives so it could hold the papers, archive them, provide research access, a research room, and a museum. And so he created the first presidential library, and the presidential library system followed. But after him, and for, you know, as I said, through President Carter, that was a voluntary thing. The president could voluntarily build us a building and give us the building and the records, and they didn't have to. Well, all that changed in 1978 with the passage of the Presidential Records Act. And it was actually one of the post-Watergate reforms that were passed after Watergate and the Watergate scandal, the Nixon administration, because one of the concerns was when President Nixon left office, and technically all the papers and all the tapes, the very famous Watergate tapes, belonged to him and they were his personal property. And if he wanted to, he could throw them away, he could destroy them. And in fact, that was his intent, at least with respect to the tapes. He was going to donate the papers, but was not going to donate the tapes and was intending to destroy them. So Congress passed a special law for the Nixon papers, a law that seized all the Nixon papers and tapes and all the materials and gave them to the National Archives. And that's why we have a special statute that just governs Nixon papers and tapes. But then part 2 of that law set up a special commission to study the records of the government, of presidential papers, as well as congressional and Supreme Court papers, and make recommendations on what to do with them. And this study commission actually issued a report in like 1977 and said, you know, these should be government property, and Congress should pass a law, a special law governing not just presidential records, but also congressional records and Supreme Court records. That was the recommendation of the commission. Congress, as it's known to do, decided to pass a law called the Presidential Records Act and never passed a law called the Congressional Records Act. So to this day, the records of Congress belong to the Congress. The records of members of Congress belong to them personally, and they can do whatever they want with their office files and paper. The records of Supreme Court justices to this day belong to the justice when they leave or die or retire. They can do whatever they want. They tend to donate them either to the Library of Congress or some other institution. But that's the history, the very quick short history of how we got the Presidential Records Act, which passed in 1978, applied to the next president who came in, which was Ronald Reagan. So only starting with Ronald Reagan are presidential records government property. And as Meg noted at the beginning, rules and process of under the PRA, the Presidential Records Act, are actually quite different than the FRA. And while the president's in office, the president has complete control of managing the records of his office, and NARA actually has virtually no legal role or authority over the president and presidential records while the president's in office. But importantly, the moment the president leaves office, the records automatically transfer to the National Archives into our legal custody the moment he leaves office. So that is what occurred just barely, I guess, what are we talking about, 27 hours ago at 12:01 yesterday on January 20th, when the President Trump left office. All Trump presidential records came into NARA's legal custody, and now they are our records. We own them and we control them. And so for us, the presidential transition is a huge and complex effort to, we know we're going to have legal custody, is to obtain physical custody of a vast, vast trove of records, which are now almost, entirely electronic. And there's just a relatively small volume of paper that comes out of the White House these days compared to the electronic records. And so we can get into, further down some of the details. I've noticed there have been some questions, and I'll take it. I'll just note a question, say, about tweets. So a government record under both the FRA and the PRA can be in any format. The lawsuit that I helped bring against on the last day of the Reagan administration was trying to say, hey, emails like those NSC prof notes that were part of the Iran-Contra scandal, that was the first emails in the government. Those emails, the electronic version of those emails, those are records. They can't just throw them away. They're governed by the Presidential Records Act. And the government argued at the time, no, they're not. They're kind of like message slips. They're just, as long as we print out the paper copy, then that's all that matters. The electronic copy is not a record. The court, we thought otherwise when I was at the ACLU, and the court agreed and said, no, those are government records as well in electronic format. And in our view, and in the law's view, records can be in any format. Of course, there's photos and film and some of the more traditional alternative formats from paper, but any electronic version of a record, and that includes tweets, that includes any electronic messaging app in addition to email. It's not the format, it's the content. So in this case, yes, all the tweets on @RealDonaldTrump are presidential records, and we will be getting those. And
I think let's hold off and talk about what exactly is happening when we get a little deeper into our discussion, because we're definitely
going to quick since I saw people already asking about that, I figured I'd jump on that.
Yep, nope, that's great. So we're all living in a world that Gary partly built by the litigation from the ACLU. All right, so that was all just background, because you need to understand how those laws work to understand what NARA is capable of doing and what we're responsible for doing at the time of transition. So at this point, let's move into this really specific case about what has NARA been doing to prepare for the transition. Laurence, let's go back to you. What have we been doing to support federal agencies as they're preparing to get new leadership?
So it's a very busy time under the FRA and our interactions with agencies. Maybe not quite as busy as it is on the PRA side of things, where you have to deal with the physical and legal transfer of records. What we do, though, and it's more working with the staff, the professionals within the agencies, where we're focusing on getting out a message with updated guidance to all of our agencies that reminds them of their responsibilities under the Federal Records Act, and ensures that the professionals there in the agencies are talking to the senior officials, political appointees, and most importantly, any officials who are departing service or coming on board during the transition. So one of the things we want to make sure is that federal records are not removed from agency custody. We want to make sure that the records are protected, and that those officials who are either coming or departing are either debriefed as part of exit clearance, or made aware of their records responsibilities as they take on the duties of leading their agencies. So, for us, it's really about communication. We have done a lot in terms of making available guidance to agencies and to the public. We have included a lot of content up on our public website, online resources such as our Documenting Your Public Service Guide, creating checklists for political appointees to make sure that they're executing their records management responsibilities appropriately. And one of the things that we've really done a lot this year in this transition is really using our blog, Records Express. It's very easy to find. You just Google Records Express, it'll come up. And you will see on Records Express that we've done 4 posts specific to transition that covers things like, proper management of email, making sure that agency officials are not using personal accounts to conduct business, for example, guidance about social media, about websites, about the records of the transition team of the president-elect before inauguration. So there's a lot of ways that we try and get out the guidance. We also, quite significantly this year, the Archivist of the United States wrote a memo in November to all agency heads covering 4 areas: email management, entrance and exit briefings for officials, the proper management of social media accounts, including encrypted messaging applications, and the management of web records. So we wanted to make sure that at the highest level of our agency, we were getting that message out to all of the agencies subject to the Federal Records Act. And then I, in particular, did a number of targeted briefings. So thanks to Gary, I met with general counsels across the government. I met with the CIO Council, the Chief Data Officers Council, SIGI, which is the group of inspectors general across the government, and even got communication out to agency web managers across the government, and trying to reach out to these very specific communities that we may not normally talk to because we typically work through the records professionals within the agencies, to just expand the scope of what we are telling agencies that they need to do to make sure that the records are protected and properly managed before, during, and after the transition.
And Laurence, before we leave you, let me just kind of ask you to restate something I heard you say a little earlier about the primary people that NARA is working with at federal agencies. One of the things that I hear people speculating about is that there might be political pressure, for example, to destroy records for nefarious purposes. And my understanding that the political appointees do not have their fingers in records management very often. And I wonder if you'll speak to the type of people who are actually doing the work of managing records at federal agencies.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question, and it's a concern we hear every now and then. But it's important to note that my staff, I mean, first to start with, there is someone on my staff who is assigned as the primary point of contact with every federal agency that we work. And through the interaction that my staff have with an agency, they're working directly with an agency records officer who reports to a senior agency official for records management. And in almost all cases, in fact, I can't even think of an exception, the records officers and the senior agency officials are career government officials. They're not political appointees. They don't come and go with transitions, and they provide that continuity. But more importantly, I think what they represent is a commitment to proper records management and making sure that their agency is compliant with the requirements that we have in the laws and in our regs. So there have been cases, and I'm sure there will again, where a career professional or records officer may be directed by a political appointee to do something which is not compliant with the law. And in those cases, they may contact the National Archives, they may contact their own inspector general, they may file a complaint, because in those cases, we have seen time and again that the professionals that we work with are committed to the work itself and making sure that records management is properly carried out and executed within agencies.
So if somebody, a member of the public or a historian or a journalist or another federal employee does hear about a case when it really sounds like a federal record has been destroyed in a way that does not sound like it's appropriate, it sounds like something sneaky has been going on, is there anything that they can do about it?
Absolutely.
Like, can they tell it?
Absolutely. And we have a very transparent and visible presence when it comes to unauthorized disposition cases. I mean, it's something that is specified in the law, clarified in our regs. But for the public, and really anyone who would have a concern, we have a dedicated website and a mailbox, unauthorized disposition at NARA.gov, where anyone who becomes aware of a potential incident or has been made aware of an allegation, it is our responsibility to engage with the agency and ensure that they thoroughly investigate the allegation and then report to us. And there are specific timeframes by which an agency must respond to us for any allegation of unauthorized disposition, which, in a nutshell, is any record that is removed or destroyed not consistent with an approved record schedule. So if a schedule says there's a temporary record that can't be destroyed for 20 years, and it turns out that they were destroyed after 10 years, then we need to work with an agency, thoroughly investigate it, and an agency needs to put in place remediation, corrective actions to make sure that no recurrence of that kind of circumstance would happen again. So it is something that we take very seriously. As I said, we have a website, and on that website, you also find all the correspondence that the National Archives sends to agencies when we open a case or close a case, summarizing the facts. And then agencies and the public can then be aware and accountable for making sure that the records are managed properly and in accordance with schedules.
Thanks. And I've been trying to drop the URLs into the chat, although that last URL is like a crazy long one. But if you just want to search unauthorized disposition National Archives, you'll end up right on the right page. So that's great information. So in passing, Laurence kind of alluded to the fact that, most federal agency records get destroyed, and that's normal and it's fine. We have record schedules that tell agencies when it's legal for them to do that, and we expect them to do it because the government is creating so much stuff and most of it is not that interesting, and the National Archives has limited resources to archive it. So we're really trying to be selective and archive only the really, really important stuff that we believe people will need to see in the future. So there's some destruction of records that's completely normal and appropriate. And then, there's always the possibility that there'll be some destruction that's not. Okay, so we're gonna move on and move back to presidential records, since a lot of the questions are coming in about presidential records, and presidential transition is really why we're here. So Gary, President Trump's records have been a focus of a lot of concern and speculation recently. So let's talk about how NARA has been working with the Trump administration on the management of presidential records. Just going back to the beginning of the administration, like how have we been working with them to prepare for this moment?
So, Laurence described the very detailed process, procedures, regulations, and actual oversight role and authority we have under the Federal Records Act in working with agencies, and even, which includes the ability to effectively investigate unauthorized disposal, and also in which, they can't dispose of anything without the actual legal authority from the Archives of the United States. Under the PRA, it's, as I noted before, very different. NARA has really no formal role in overseeing or regulating how the White House and the president manages their records. So, so the way it works for us and for them is essentially we provide guidance, voluntary guidance to the White House based on our institutional knowledge and expertise, and having worked with presidential records in prior administrations, and offer that assistance, which fortunately every administration welcomes and appreciates NARA's input, in part because they understand, and we make clear, and it's clear under the law that their records will automatically transfer to us. So everything they create is going to come to us. So we, in fact, you know, from the very first day of the administration, our most common statement to them is, you know, from our perspective, the transition of records begins on the first day, and on day one, you should be preparing for your last day. And what we also commonly say to every administration coming in is, you know, we are a non-political, nonpartisan agency. We always prefer a two-term presidency because it's the easiest to plan a transition when you know when the end is coming. But we always have to prepare for a one-term transition, and cooperatively with the White House. And I had that very conversation with Trump officials, and it's principally the Office of the Counsel of the President that oversees records management in coordination with there's an Office of Records Management and then the IT staff in the White House. And so we said from day one, we got to be ready for a one-term transition if it happens, and we should be planning and preparing for that. And this administration, or the past administration, Trump administration, was very supportive and very cooperative in planning and preparing. And then we really stepped that up in the last year and said, we really have to be engaged and do all that we can to prepare in case there's a one-term transition, you know, a year out. And that began a very active and continuous engagement between us and White House officials on essentially accounting for and indexing all the electronic systems that they have, knowing what they have, knowing what's the volume, the format, the types, and then discussing and preparing how those records in those electronic systems will have to be exported out of whatever live proprietary system they use and transformed into an archival format that works with our electronic records archives, our you know, permanent archival repository for electronic records. And so that's the complexity. And in this case, and just to give you a quick summary of how the volume of electronic records has escalated in the last 20 years. When Clinton was really the first president that would use wide-scale electronic records and email. At the end of the Clinton administration, we got roughly 22 million emails and a total of 3 terabytes of electronic records total. 8 years later, Bush, 43, when he left office, we got 220 million emails and roughly 85, 90 terabytes of electronic records. 8 years later, when Obama left, we got over 300 million emails and roughly 250 terabytes of data. And now at 4 years, we're still you know, kind of adding and counting up what's going to be coming to us, but it could be as much as 500 terabytes just in 4 years compared to 250 of Obama in 8 years, and it should be less emails, but probably 200 million emails and 500 terabytes of electronic records. So the volumes are huge, and the project of a transition is to ensure that we get all of it and we get it, you know, properly exported out of their systems, and so it can be ingested and imported into our system. So that's kind of the core of the work and the effort. And of course, that does include all the social media accounts, and that gets even more complicated because those are run on third-party platforms, you know, on Twitter, on Facebook. Those are privately run systems, and there are tools and apps that can sort of auto-archive those things, those records, you know, on those systems, so that we can get them. And that's, you know, and that's something we're still working on, and that's been, you know, somewhat complicated. And I believe someone asked, well, what happened when they shut down Trump's Twitter account just 2 weeks ago or whenever that was? And that did cause a little hiccup, because the way it normally works is they transfer, we literally take over the passwords, and they got to transfer the passwords to us. The White House does, but they lost control of those accounts, so the White House couldn't do that and give us the sort of password control on those accounts. And anyway, so that's has complicated it, but we're working at it. And just the last point to make is, in a one-term transition, when you don't know for sure it's going to happen until election day, or till the day after election day, or whenever the election is called, then you only have less than 3 months to do a project that took us more than 6 months to do the Obama transition. When we started moving records from then nuts, we started in the summer before he was leaving, and it took over roughly 6 months to do it when we could plan for it in a 2-term. It's impossible to get it all done by the day of a transition. And so we will still be working with the White House data center, and IT folks to do the actual physical transfer of their electronic records for some period of time now after the end of the administration.
Thanks, Gary. So I think you've actually covered an awful lot of what we intended to say. And at this point, I'd like to go back and catch some of these questions that went by to make sure that we're answering them completely. There were a number of questions about social media accounts, and that was something that we knew was going to come up. It's been a topic of a lot of conversation, just because it's been so important to this administration. So what I want to do is I'm sort of working in 2 places at once. So I'm going to invite Gary to talk more in response to these specific questions, including the legal status of @RealDonaldTrump, as well as the POTUS Twitter account, what the federal government's rights to those accounts are, what happened to their Facebook page. Does Twitter itself have any proprietary interests? Who owns what, and how will this information be stored and accessed? And before I invite Gary to start answering that question, and I'm trying to encourage him to address a couple of questions that came in related to social media. At the same time, I'm going to share my screen and show you something that we released just yesterday. So it's just going to be background as Gary talks, if that's all right with you, Gary. So go to town.
Yeah, so the further details on social media accounts that are used by government officials, by White House officials in this case, it's ultimately not it's not who controls the account. It's what's on the account. It's the content of the message that is conveyed by a government official. If it relates to their official duties, then it's a government record. It's a presidential record. Whether they do it on an official account or on their personal account. Now we all know that Donald Trump, used even though he had the @POTUS, which is the official White House president's Twitter account, he nonetheless decided to continue to use his personal Twitter handle @RealDonaldTrump from day one until it was cut off about 2 weeks ago. But in our view, all those tweets are government records governed by the PRA, and they now belong to us, even though they were done on his personal account. The fact that it was his personal account, I believe, from Twitter's perspective, it's the owner of the account owns the records, not Twitter. And it's up to the owner, to control access. And so, whereas the owner of @POTUS was the White House, was the government, but the owner of @RealDonaldTrump is Donald Trump. And so it's complicated things a little bit just to ensure that we're getting the passwords and can get direct access. But we will, and I'm confident of that. Meg just shared our screen, which is the brand new TrumpLibrary.gov website. It's essentially it's a NARA website in which we essentially post electronic records of the former administration. And there's an ObamaLibrary.gov and a Bush 43 library and a ClintonLibrary.gov website as well. And we capture essentially the actual whitehouse.gov website on its last day with all the content on that, and then we will use it to make available other presidential records, including the Twitter accounts and other social media, the Facebook account. Again, Facebook, Trump's Facebook was shut down. We will nonetheless get all the content from that and preserve it as a presidential record, and eventually make it accessible. It's going to take us some time, just again because of the complexities of a one-term transition and how little time we had to really get all this done before we can, make it publicly available, but we will. And Meg, was there anything else?
I didn't know that I was going to do this. So I just pulled up the archived Twitter account for POTUS 45. And so that account is now owned by the National Archives, and it is still available on Twitter in that form.
Right. So at POTUS, we switched the Trump at POTUS to at POTUS 45 so that it could be shut off, because now the at POTUS is Biden's account. Again, that's a government account that the White House and NARA owns and controls. At Real Donald Trump, if it's ever restored, that would, in the future, that would be Donald Trump's personal Twitter, and in the future, he could do whatever he wants with it. But for the 4 years that he served, from January 20th of 2017 until this month, all the tweets on that are government records, and so we'll be getting those.
Okay, so the last question that we had prepared is Gary and Laurence have, in passing, addressed most of the questions that we thought you needed to hear about. The last thing we actually wanted to invite them to talk about before shifting full-time to answering the questions that you've sent in through the Q&A box is, what happens next? So we've just had an inauguration. Does that mean that the work of transition is over? And what will the National Archives be focused on now? Laurence, do you want to start?
Sure. So the work of transition is really never done. So as you might imagine, throughout the year, every year of an administration, there are always new political appointees designated, leaving service, and other senior officials that come and go. So the kinds of things that we are really focused on to a high degree during the transition, we still need to be able to talk to agencies about those same things, all during the year as well. And one of the things when we talk to the records officers and the senior agency officials for records management is making sure that they understand that whenever there are changes in appointments, in designations, we need to be informed about those, but then they also need to make sure that they provide the briefings, the trainings, make sure that people who are coming in or departing service are following the requirements that we have for all federal employees, and making sure they understand their responsibilities. So there are basic things that we do all the time. All agencies are required to provide records management training for all of their staff, but there are very specific things that we do for senior officials in terms of briefings. And one of the things that I do in my role is meeting very often with all the senior agency officials for records management and trying to address any concerns that they have about briefing their bosses, the heads of agencies, the political appointees, about their requirements for records management. So it's something that in terms of what comes next, it's something that we will continue to do and continue to stay focused on to make sure that the agencies know what they need to do. And we do, as I noted, we have assigned contacts for every agency that we can work with, and we rely on that network and the professionalism of the records staff within each agency to make sure that those briefings and those requirements are clearly communicated.
Excellent. So Gary, before I kick this over to you, I'm going to read one of the questions that seems to me to be directly related to what I was going to invite you to talk about in the presidential side anyway. So the question says, did NARA have a liaison office at the White House during the Trump administration? And will NARA make an effort to reestablish this function in the Biden administration? So that seems like a perfect, like, what happens during the transition now, looking forward on the presidential record side?
No, so we do not and have not, as long as I've been here since 1998, had a formal NARA liaison office in the White House. And so I'm not entirely sure what the question was thinking about. We do, I mean, there is the Office of the Presidential Diarist, and the official diarist has been and continues to be a NARA employee on detail to the White House. So we have that person there. I do think— I don't think
so much about the specifics about how that's set up, but just how NARA works with the White House.
So we don't have a formal office, but we have, as I noted before, just an ongoing communication with White House officials about all, PRA records management issues that come up and from an ongoing basis. And it's pretty much centered between myself and my counterparts in the White House counsel's office, in which there's always a PRA, one of the lawyers in the White House counsel's office has signed the Presidential Records Act mantle, in a sense, and that's the person I communicate with on a regular basis, sometimes daily, certainly almost always weekly. And then John Laster, who is NARA's director of the White House Liaison Division, he's the senior archivist in NARA that works in tandem with the White House on actual records management questions and issues. And because we do two important functions for the White House. We actually do provide physical courtesy storage of the current administration's records in our building. When they run out of space, our National Archives building on the Mall supports them. And then we also respond to requests by the current administration for records of former presidents. And that's another aspect of the Presidential Records Act that we administer, and John and I do that together to respond to formal legal requests from the current administration to records of the former administrations, all of them, going back to Reagan. So we work with them in that way, but it's not a formal liaison office. It's just how we work and what we do. So going forward with the Biden administration, we were working with them during transition and giving them our guidance and input and lessons learned. We always sort of apply the lessons learned of the last administration that they should do for their administration, and improve where there are weaknesses and that we've noted and experienced, and that you've read about in the press and all that they should be aware of and try to attend to, and in the guidance that they give to all their staff under the Presidential Records Act, and then work on a continuous and ongoing basis.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to shift wholeheartedly to answering the questions that have come into the Q&A box. And I am not really addressing these in order. I'm just trying to sort out some that we might be able to quickly get through. And I'm going to tell Gary and Laurence, and I confess that these are mainly going to be for Gary. We've got 11 or 12 to get through in just 5 minutes. So this is not a place to expand extensively. We're going to try to crank through some of these questions quickly. So the first question I would like to invite Gary to address in particular is, are presidential records already redacted when they come to the National Archives, or is that work done later?
They are not. We get, and traditionally for all permanent records, whether they're presidential records in the White House or permanent records from an agency, we get them in their original format as much as possible and full and complete. And then it's up to us and our responsibility, and it's the archivists, on our staff assigned to, who get assigned to different records collections, who do the review and redaction where necessary. And unfortunately for presidential records, they're just chock full of sensitivities. And so we have to do a lot of it. And that, frankly, is why we have ever-growing backlogs, because that's still a slow, tedious process, you know, for which there's not, even though there's some electronic assistance and automated review assistance, it still requires, you know, humans to review and make sure we are redacting what's classified, what's sensitive personal privacy or law enforcement type of information out of them before we can release them to the public. But we have them in their original format, and then to the extent they're released with redactions, that's what we do.
Excellent. So I just see a question that came in relatively late, but I think it's quick to answer, and I may risk answering it myself. Can you speak more to the automation of the process? When you say they are automatically transferred to NARA, what does that mean exactly? I believe that what we meant was that the Presidential Records Act acts to transfer legal custody of the records at noon on Inauguration Day, and that happens whether anybody does anything or not. The legal status of those records changes automatically under the law. We do not have conveyor belts of records automatically transferring physical records, and there's no automated pipeline of electronic records transferring electronic records, you know, automatically in that sense from the White House to the National Archives.
Except I will say that eventually we're getting there. So of course, if it's paper, there are boxes that have to be picked up with trucks, you know, from the White House and then driven over to our building. Electronic records, traditionally, even the last administration, they were loaded, you know, copied onto servers in the White House data center, and we would pick up those servers on a truck and ship them to our data center. But
there's a surprising number of
the world is changing, and with cloud hosting, with more and more records being hosted in the cloud, a lot is going to allow for, and in fact, we're going to be able to do it with some records even now, essentially a cloud-to-cloud transfer. And so, you know, from the White House cloud account to NARA's cloud account. Now, if we're both using the same cloud service provider, it's easier than if, you know, I mean, there's Amazon, there's Microsoft, maybe there's IBM. There's only about 3 major cloud service providers. And so depending on who the provider is and who both sides are using, we're getting to this, you know, this possibility of at least, you know, virtual transfer of records from, you know, from one space in the cloud to another space in the cloud.
Okay, we've got a couple of closely related questions related to whether we are able to speak to whether there are any holes in the historical record being transferred by the Trump administration. This is part of a question that also mentioned the Facebook page. I'm not going to go back to the social media accounts. Should we really be concerned about holes in the archival material other than just normal? And then the other question from someone else is, has NARA seen any evidence of Trump administration non-compliance with what the FRA or PRA requires? And if so, can we elaborate?
So on the last question, I can start by saying, you know, there has been a lot of allegations, and there's been a fair amount of litigation against agencies in the Trump administration for improper records management, to which their problems have been found. And, you know, courts have ruled against administrations. And where it really comes up, you know, is like, especially in the complex area where folks are, you know, like, how are they managing texts and records on, you know, on personal email, which they're not supposed to do, but people still do it. And in those areas. And so certainly there have been problems. In the PRA world, there are lawsuits, it's harder to actually sue. And so some of those allegations haven't necessarily been formally addressed by the courts. What I will say is, I mean, at the end of the day, NARA receives whatever the White House gives us. And that's all we ultimately know is we take in what they give us. We don't have insight into essentially what, you know, their systems as they're creating the records. And so on the one hand, you know, we don't know what we don't know. On the other hand, virtually all records are created electronically now. And we do know that their systems, you know, the way they manage the systems that they create, you know, they have auto archiving in a sense. And so all emails are effectively automatically archived. it's very hard, therefore, to delete, you know, to intentionally delete electronic records and emails from you know, the White House data centers without involving a lot of people in that, you know, what would be a clearly illegal activity, including the, you know, career professionals who run the data centers and the, you know, the IT folks in the White House. So, you know, doesn't mean it couldn't be done, but it would be a hard thing to do intentionally. Now, we also know that in the Bush administration, front page news, 5 million missing emails did occur. And that was not intentional. That was a classic computer glitch and a kind of a screw up, you know, an unintentional screw up, you know, in the IT systems that resulted in massive failure for their archiving system to collect the records. And so that can happen. That's where the big problems lie. They then had to go and restore, you know, millions and millions of emails from backup tapes and such. And so you can have serious problems and serious gaps. Generally, they are more on the technical side, is our experience, than on the intentional side. At a big level, you know, of course, Trump did. There's no question. He tore up records and threw them in the trash. But it does appear that they literally collected all those trash bins and pulled out the records and taped them back up. So we're still going to get them.
So I acknowledge that it is 4 o'clock on the East Coast, and we were only scheduled to go for an hour. There are a bunch of really good questions about how the Obama library model worked and what we're expecting for a Trump presidential library. I want to very quickly say that the legal status of those records is not different from the presidential records back to Reagan. So this is a question of like whether the former president raises money for a building and gives it to the National Archives. The legal status of the records and our processes do not change on that. So that's at least a partial answer to the questions about that. There are a bunch of other really good questions, but I need to respect your time. We may be able to get in touch with people or maybe work through the OAH to get answers to some of those other questions. But at this point, I'd like to invite Beth to wrap it up if it's necessary to get us off the webinar promptly.
If you all want to stay and answer the questions, that's perfectly fine from my standpoint. And you know, the recording will be available if our attendees need to leave. But if you all need to leave, you know, you've very generously given an hour, more than an hour, so it's up to you all.
So I see that some people are dropping off, but there's still 56 people connected. I could certainly stay an additional 5 minutes and we could probably get to a few other really meaty questions.
I can stay on as
Gary,
well. I don't mind. I'd be happy to, you know, try to see what we can get through and finish up responding to people's
I'm more than
questions.
happy to contribute 5 minutes to the cause.
Wonderful, thank you guys.
Okay, let's do that. Laurence, there's actually a question for you. Does NARA work with executive branch agency heads on the disposition of their personal files, or is that handled by the agency records managers? Does NARA provide courtesy storage of materials that belong to political appointees?
So the second question, it's easier. No, we don't provide courtesy storage. But the more substantive answer is we do rely on the professionals, the records officers and the senior agency officials, records management, to work with those political appointees to help them do what every federal employee must do, which is be able to identify the records that they're creating and segregate them from personal materials that they may have that don't relate to the official conduct of their business. And that's what we rely on agencies to do. And it's one of the things that we may look at and sort of gets to another point that Gary was talking about a little bit a few minutes ago in terms of compliance. One of the things we do that I mentioned is we conduct inspections. And of course, there is non-compliance on the Federal Records Act and in executive branch agencies. And that's why we do the inspections and work with agencies to make sure that they have plans of corrective action in place. Because a lot of it is, as Gary noted, unintentional, or they don't have the resources, the staffing, the funding to be able to do what they need to do. So we work with them to help them figure out what are the gaps and how they can fill those gaps. And that would apply to, you know, this particular question. We need political appointees, heads of agencies to manage their records like everybody else. And part of that is being able to understand what a record is and segregate it from personal materials that they may be maintaining as well.
Thank you. I see a question that I think has a very short answer, which is, are White House records part of presidential records or governed by the FRA? And I'm going to offer a quick and dirty answer and let Gary correct me if I get this wrong. I think we are sometimes sloppy in saying White House when we really mean presidential records. Many White House records are presidential records, but not all of them. There are some functions within the White House that are actually governed by the Federal Records Act. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, and that's it's this weird anomaly. But within what they call the Executive Office of the President, you have a number of components that are governed by the PRA, like the White House Office, the Office of the Vice President, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors. Then you have a number of components that essentially have been determined to be federal agencies subject to the FRA and FOIA. That includes OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the United States Trade Rep, the Council on Environmental Quality, and several other offices. So there is a weird split in the EOP, essentially half PRA, half FRA, but the president and those whose function is to solely advise and assist the president, those are the folks who are governed by the PRA, and it's pretty much split by function. And so within within the EOP, they know who they are, and in fact, the FRA components in the EOP have different email addresses that associates with their, sort of mini agency.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. There are a couple of really, again, kind of meaty questions, and I think these are the last two we're going to try to address live, and they have to do with the experience of researchers trying to use presidential records. So I'm actually going to read this whole question. A problem for historians, journalists, and other members of the public concerned about the failure to create records, as we saw, for example, with messaging apps and the failure to create records on meetings with heads of state, is discovery beyond media reports. Can members of the public gain access to the complaints filed with the Inspector General so as to have a better understanding of failure to create and efforts to destroy records before it's too late, before the end of the presidential term, before it's too late to maybe salvage those records or find them? Is there anything we can say about that?
Well, I mean, on one hand, that's a real issue. I mean, both the FRA and the PRA create, some type of affirmative obligation to adequately and properly document what's done at the agency or what's done in the White House. The laws say they have to do that, but what that means and how to actually make people create records, i.e. take notes of meetings, for example, is it's never been clear how one forces people to do that. If they don't create a record, then it doesn't exist at that level. So, and certainly over time, folks on the one hand have gotten less formal about creating, like the NSC used to have very formal minutes of every formal NSC meeting, and that stopped in the Clinton administration, and now they don't exist at that level. On the other hand, we have 300 million emails from the Obama administration, and just about anything that happens in any meeting tends to get ultimately sent, described and sent in an email somewhere. So there's probably a record of it. It's just in a different format, in a different way, and it's hard to figure. It not necessarily easy to find, but it probably exists somewhere, but not in the old formal way that the NSC minutes of the Kennedy Library, don't exist anymore.
Can I ask the specific question, Laurence may know this, about the records of complaints to Inspector Generals?
So, I mean, those records are covered by schedules. They would be available through a normal FOIA process. If someone in the public wanted to get access to those agency records, just like any other agency records. IGs are they generally work independently from the agency. So, they protect their independence, but they are federal employees and or be governed by the same processes.
Okay, so there are unanswered questions here, but I'm cherry picking one I think is particularly important, and it has to do, although to be honest, I'm not sure I've got exactly the right NARA people here to fully answer this question, but I think we can make a start at it, which is how records are actually made available to researchers in the presidential libraries. And the question is contrasting the more fully processed older pre-PRA libraries with the post-Reagan libraries where things are processed sort of piecemeal. And so part of the question is, could you speak a bit more about the schedule for processing archives under the PRA? And are we as researchers really beholden to Congress just deciding when and whether to allocate funds for processing the collection?
So I can't address that, and I'm familiar with the issue and the problem. And the short of it is, well, the short answer is under the PRA, there's no public access to records for the first 5 years when the president leaves office. And another question alludes to that right now you cannot make a request for Obama records, but a year from yesterday you will be able to. And the easiest way to make a request is under FOIA. And then what happens at President PRA libraries is almost on that first day, 5 years out, we get such a flurry of FOIA requests that the backlog begins, in that first day or first week of FOIA requests. And given the limited,
flurry is not the right word. We get an avalanche of FOIA.
And it's an avalanche of requests, and then the volume of records we have is so big, and the requests can be so big. Essentially, we just get stuck in the FOIA queue and have no time to do any other type of processing. And what I think the questioner is referencing, in the older libraries, FOIA did not apply. And so the libraries could pick and choose what they wanted to release and review, and they could do it systematically just across a whole swath and not piecemeal per whatever the requester is asking for. So on one hand, they could process a lot more records more quickly because they could just do it systematically. But they were doing it essentially what they wanted to release. The library did, with input from the public and not under the legal requirements of the Freedom of Information Act. So that's the difference. But it is absolutely ultimately a question of resources. How many people do we have to be able to review the volume of records that are responsive to all the requests? And that is ultimately we are beholden to Congress and to the administration to dependent on what funding we get, how we staff can staff our facilities.
So I lied. I'm going to sneak in one last question, which is kind of a follow-up to the previous one, which is there any recourse if a political appointee just refuses to follow the Federal Records Act? Can NARA do anything? Can anyone do anything in the case of a bad actor?
Well, so if while they're in office, if they're destroying records improperly, that can be a criminal offense. So they could be committing a crime, it could be investigated. It is explicitly supposed to be subject to administrative penalties, and all people can be fired, disciplined if they are intentionally violating the records laws like anything else. The tougher question happens and does happen when folks leave office. If they take records with them, what can we do? That's when under the Federal Records Act, we could obtain assistance from the Department of Justice and go after them and essentially file a legal action against them to return the records that they've improperly removed from the government. And we have actually had some instances where we've had to, usually we approach them first and say, hey, we think you have government records, you need to give them back. And generally they do, because if they don't, then we tell them we're going to sue you. So those are some of the recourses. Now, if they're refusing to create records, we already asked, that question was asked, and that's a harder thing to make someone create something, that they're not creating. If they're refusing to provide access, that's a FOIA issue, and that's what?
Oh, I was just saying there is some discretion under the law about what's adequate and proper.
Well, yeah, it's actually completely undefined and unknown, and so there's never been any good way that I'm aware of that you can absolutely mandate that people create records. And certainly not in the way you want them to create them, you know, but so.
Okay, well, I think
I
that
don't
was
know if that gets to the answer, but that's the best we have.
Laurence, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Gary covered it. I mean, there's always something that we can do, and there will always be something that we will try to do, working with the agency, with the Department of Justice, if it's appropriate, to make sure that those instances do not happen and corrections are made.
Okay, great. So at this point, thank you for the extra time for you hardcore records fans who hung on till the end, and for anybody watching on video, I hope the additional bonus few minutes were useful. So I really do want to thank the OAH for inviting us to come talk to you. I think this was a great opportunity for the National Archives to help explain what we do, chance for you to ask questions. And so we've made a note of all the questions that you've asked, even the ones that weren't directly relevant to the topic of today's discussion, and we're really grateful for the chance to talk to you all. I also am going to share my screen as Beth wraps us up, I think, just to show a few last URLs that you might find useful. So let's see if I can do this. That's not quite what I wanted to do.
While Meg is getting the slide up, I'll come back on and say thank you to Gary, Laurence, and Meg for sharing your afternoon with us and really getting into the nuts and bolts of what you and your colleagues at the National Archives do to preserve our governmental records. And thank you for everybody who attended. It was the turnout was really great to see how many people signed up for this, and we hope that you're as excited about upcoming programming that we are going to have. After this is over, we will have a very short 4-question survey that if you'd be willing to fill out, it'll help us direct what we're going to do for future content. And then as soon as the recording of this is available, we will be sending you an email so that you can access that. It'll be publicly available on our website. So thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.